The empire's streets gleamed with marble, its temples soared toward the heavens, and its rulers were praised as bringers of order and civilization. But beneath the grandeur, in the shadows of palaces and marketplaces, another reality pulsed with terror. Here, the cries of the enslaved echoed against stone walls, their bodies bearing the scars of punishments designed not merely to control, but to crush. Imagine the scene: a crowded Roman amphitheater. A slave condemned for defiance is dragged before thousands of spectators. His punishment is not hidden in secrecy, but displayed as a warning, his suffering transformed into spectacle. In Sparta, helots were hunted like animals to remind them of their place. In Egypt and Mesopotamia, punishments were tied to religion itself, branding rebellion as both a crime and a sin against the gods. These punishments were not accidents of cruelty. They were calculated instruments of power, crafted to break spirits, erase resistance, and transform human beings into tools of empire. So why did civilizations that celebrated freedom, philosophy, and divine order rely on such brutality? And what do these practices reveal about the hidden foundations of power? To answer, we must uncover the shocking punishments that kept ancient empires standing. Slavery was not a side note in the story of ancient civilizations. It was the foundation on which their wealth, power, and grandeur were built. From the fertile plains of Mesopotamia to the bustling streets of Rome, from the marble temples of Greece to the monumental tombs of Egypt, slavery was everywhere. It provided labor for agriculture, service for households, soldiers for armies, and bodies for pleasure. But more than that, it created a system where human lives were commodities, and punishment was the ultimate tool to enforce obedience. Unlike modern racial slavery, ancient slavery was often rooted in war, debt, or conquest. Defeated enemies were enslaved by victors, debtors sold themselves or their families into servitude, and traders captured vulnerable groups to sell into distant lands. But regardless of origin, the reality was the same. Slaves lost their autonomy, their legal identity, and often their names. Yet slavery varied across empires. In Mesopotamia, slaves worked in households or temples. In Greece, they served as tutors, miners, and even police. In Rome, they were everywhere: laborers, gladiators, sex workers, and status symbols. Egypt employed slaves in monumental building projects and ritual service. Despite these differences, one principle united them: punishment was the glue that held slavery together. Not all slaves were treated the same. War captives often endured the harshest punishments, seen as dangerous outsiders whose loyalty could never be trusted. Household slaves might experience relative leniency, but they too faced swift retribution for disobedience. Women bore the dual burdens of labor and sexual exploitation, with punishments that targeted their bodies and fertility. Sex slaves were particularly vulnerable, their punishment often intertwined with humiliation. Unlike men, whose disobedience was punished with beatings or forced labor, women might be paraded naked, branded, or mutilated in ways designed to attack their sexuality. What made ancient slavery especially terrifying was how thoroughly it was codified into law. The Code of Hammurabi, one of the oldest legal systems, contained detailed provisions for punishing slaves. Runaways could be executed, mutilated, or returned to their masters with harsher restrictions. Owners were given near-total authority, with few protections for slaves as human beings. In Greece and Rome, laws formalized punishments to deter resistance. In Athens, a slave's testimony was only admissible in court if it was extracted under torture. Rome declared that a slave who killed his master condemned all his fellow household slaves to death, even if they were innocent. These laws reveal the logic of control. Punishment was not about justice, but about terror, ensuring that slaves lived in constant fear. Slavery thrived not only because of labor, but because of fear. Punishment was central to this system. It kept slaves submissive, reminded them of their vulnerability, and reinforced the hierarchy that placed them at the bottom of society. Beatings, whippings, branding, mutilation, crucifixion, and execution were not isolated incidents but daily reminders of power. The brutality also served a psychological purpose. By making punishment public, empires ensured that slaves were not the only ones to feel fear. Free citizens who witnessed these punishments were reminded of their own privilege and warned of the consequences of stepping out of line. In this way, slave punishments upheld the entire social order. The paradox of slavery in the ancient world is stark. Civilizations celebrated for philosophy, art, and law were built on exploitation and terror. The Greeks spoke of democracy while their economies rested on enslaved labor. Rome glorified its legal system even as it denied slaves any legal personhood. Egypt created monuments to eternity with hands that were beaten, branded, and broken. Slavery was not just tolerated, it was celebrated as a necessity of civilization. To the elites, slaves were the invisible engines of empire. Their suffering was normalized, their punishments rationalized, their humanity denied. Understanding slavery as an institution sets the stage for what follows. Each empire developed its own system of punishments: crucifixions in Rome, ritualized terror in Sparta, mutilations in Mesopotamia, and sacred violence in Egypt. Though different in form, they shared the same essence: cruelty designed not just to punish, but to control. To grasp the full horror of slavery's punishments, we must now step into Rome, where brutality was not only tolerated but turned into spectacle. Few empires matched Rome in its ability to transform cruelty into performance. For centuries, the Roman Empire dazzled the world with its architecture, laws, and military discipline. Yet beneath its marble facade lay a society that perfected the art of punishing slaves. Rome did not merely control its enslaved population through fear, it showcased their suffering, turning pain into theater and execution into ritual. The Roman elite built their power on two foundations: conquest abroad and domination at home. Slaves represented both. And when slaves resisted, Rome responded with punishments designed to terrorize, humiliate, and remind everyone that the empire's order was written in blood. Crucifixion was not invented by Rome, but Rome perfected it. For the freeborn citizen, crucifixion was considered too degrading, reserved instead for slaves, rebels, and foreigners. Its purpose was not efficiency but agony. Victims were stripped, scourged, and forced to carry the very crossbeam upon which they would die. For slaves, crucifixion was the final demonstration of subjugation. Their bodies were nailed to wooden beams, often at crossroads or outside city gates, where passers-by could not ignore the spectacle. Death was slow, sometimes lasting days, while birds and insects fed on open wounds. The victim's suffering became a public warning. Disobedience was not just fatal, it was humiliating. One infamous example followed the revolt of Spartacus in 71 BCE. After the rebellion was crushed, more than 6,000 captured slaves were crucified along the Appian Way. Their bodies stretched for miles, lining the road like a grotesque gallery of terror. The message was unmistakable. Rebellion would not just fail, it would end in agony on display for all of Rome to see. Not every slave was crucified, but all lived under the constant threat of physical violence. Roman law allowed masters to beat their slaves at will, often in public. Whippings with leather thongs embedded with metal or bone were common, leaving scars that marked the body for life. Punishments could escalate to torture, particularly when authorities sought confessions. Roman courts often relied on slave testimony, but the law declared that such testimony was only valid if extracted under torture. This created a system where guilt or innocence became secondary. The real objective was terror. Torture devices ranged from racks that stretched limbs to hooks that tore flesh. For women, punishments often included sexual humiliation. Female slaves might be stripped and flogged before crowds, their suffering both punishment and spectacle. In Rome, the pain of the enslaved was considered legitimate entertainment. Branding was another weapon of control. Slaves were sometimes branded with letters on their foreheads, marking them as fugitives or criminals. The stigma of the mark extended beyond the physical wound, transforming the slave into a walking advertisement of their disgrace. Mutilation was also employed. Runaways could have their Achilles tendons cut, permanently disabling them. Others were forced to wear iron collars inscribed with messages such as, "Hold me, lest I escape." These punishments combined physical cruelty with psychological degradation, ensuring that even survival carried lifelong scars. Perhaps the most infamous form of slave punishment in Rome was forced participation in the gladiatorial arena. Not all gladiators were slaves, but many were prisoners of war, criminals, or rebellious servants, condemned to fight for the amusement of spectators. For the enslaved, the arena was not a stage of glory, but a death sentence disguised as spectacle. Armed with crude weapons, often pitted against wild beasts or seasoned fighters, slaves became expendable pawns in Rome's theatre of blood. Their deaths satisfied both the public's appetite for violence and the state's need to display dominance. The humiliation of the arena was not just in the combat, but in the context. Tens of thousands of citizens cheered as human beings were torn apart. This collective gaze transformed punishment into ritual, embedding cruelty into the very fabric of Roman culture. Enslaved women endured unique forms of punishment rooted in sexual violence. Rape was not considered a crime if committed against a slave. It was seen as a master's right. Beyond this, female slaves accused of defiance or immorality could be paraded naked, branded on intimate parts of the body, or forced into prostitution as punishment. One particularly cruel form of execution, damnatio ad bestias, condemnation to the beasts, often targeted enslaved women. They were stripped and sent into arenas where wild animals mauled them, their deaths consumed as eroticized spectacles of suffering. In these moments, Rome revealed its darkest truth. Women's bodies were both objects of desire and instruments of discipline. Roman cruelty extended beyond individuals. If one slave committed a crime against a master, the entire household of slaves could be executed. This principle of collective punishment reinforced an atmosphere of suspicion and fear. In 61 CE, when a Roman prefect named Pedanius Secundus was murdered by a slave, the Senate decreed that all 400 of his household slaves should be executed. Despite public protest, the sentence was carried out. The rationale was simple: allowing even one act of rebellion to go unanswered threatened the entire system of slavery. The cruelty of Rome's punishments was not only physical, but psychological. The ever-present threat of violence, combined with the spectacle of public executions, created a culture of terror. Slaves were forced to internalize obedience, knowing that any act of defiance could lead to suffering, not only for themselves, but for their communities. The Roman elite framed this cruelty as necessary for order. Slaves, they argued, were naturally rebellious and dangerous, requiring discipline through fear. Yet this justification masked the reality. Punishment was less about security and more about domination. Rome prided itself on its laws, philosophy, and culture. It gave the world systems of governance and principles of citizenship. Yet these achievements rested on the suffering of millions who had no rights, whose lives were expendable. The same empire that built aqueducts and roads also lined those roads with crucified bodies. This paradox remains one of the most haunting aspects of Roman history. The grandeur of empire and the brutality of slavery were not contradictions, they were inseparable. The punishment of slaves was not a failure of Roman civilization, it was one of its defining features. Rome's use of punishment as spectacle reveals how deeply cruelty was woven into its culture. But Rome was not unique. Other empires also turned punishment into ritual, ensuring that slaves lived in constant fear. To see this, we must turn to Greece, where democracy and philosophy coexisted with brutal control over enslaved populations. When most people picture ancient Greece, they think of gleaming temples, philosophers in flowing robes, and the birth of democracy. Yet hidden beneath these ideals of freedom and wisdom was a system built on the backs of enslaved people. In Athens, democracy was possible only because slaves performed the labor that freed citizens from toil. In Sparta, an entire enslaved population, the helots, was subjected to systematic terror designed to keep them submissive. Like Rome, Greece thrived on slavery, and like Rome, it maintained this system not simply through law, but through punishments crafted to instill fear. Slavery was everywhere in Greece. Athens, often celebrated as the cradle of democracy, had as many slaves as free citizens. They mined silver, worked fields, served in households, and even acted as police in the city. In a society that valued leisure for philosophical debate and political life, slaves were indispensable. Sparta, however, created perhaps the most infamous system. The helots enslaved people primarily from conquered Messenia were not simply servants but an entire subjugated population. Their numbers dwarfed those of the Spartan citizens, which meant constant fear of rebellion. To control them, Sparta institutionalized punishment and ritualized violence. In Athens, punishments for slaves were brutal and degrading. Whippings were routine for disobedience. Slaves were flogged in public squares or within households, the lash leaving marks that served as both discipline and reminder. Branding was also common, particularly for runaways. Marks burned into the forehead declared a slave's status as a fugitive, ensuring that they could never hide their past. These marks stigmatized them permanently, stripping away not only freedom but dignity. Athenian law also codified torture. While free citizens could testify in court, slaves could only do so under torture, since their word was considered unreliable. Devices such as the rack or heated irons were used to extract testimony, turning legal procedure into a theater of pain. In Athens, justice was built on the screams of the enslaved. No Greek city-state relied more heavily on systemic brutality than Sparta. The helots vastly outnumbered their Spartan overlords, creating constant fear of uprising. To prevent rebellion, Sparta institutionalized terror. Each year, the Spartan government declared ritual war on the helots, known as the crypteia. Spartan youths were sent into the countryside, armed with daggers and ordered to kill helots at will, especially the strongest and most defiant. These killings were not punishments for specific crimes, but preemptive acts of terror designed to keep the population submissive. Helots also faced routine humiliation. They were forced to wear degrading clothing, paraded drunk through public spaces as examples of foolishness, and subjected to regular beatings regardless of guilt. These acts reinforced the message: helots had no rights, no safety, and no identity beyond servitude. Like in Rome, enslaved women in Greece endured punishments rooted in sexual violence. Female slaves were frequently used as concubines, their bodies considered property. Resistance could result in public humiliation, sexual assault, or forced prostitution. Records describe enslaved women paraded naked through city streets as punishment, their degradation serving as both entertainment and warning. Such punishments reflected the deeply patriarchal anxieties of Greek society, where controlling female sexuality was seen as essential to maintaining order. Punishment in Greece was not only about physical suffering, it was about humiliation. Slaves were sometimes forced to wear signs announcing their crimes or paraded before the community in degrading circumstances. The use of humiliation reinforced hierarchy. By reducing slaves to objects of mockery, Greek society reminded both enslaved and free citizens of their respective places. Even children were raised to view slaves' punishments as natural, ensuring that cruelty became part of cultural education. The brutality of slave punishment in Greece was not seen as barbaric, but as natural. Philosophers like Aristotle rationalized slavery as part of the cosmic order, arguing that some people were natural slaves destined for servitude. Punishment, therefore, was framed not as cruelty, but as discipline for those deemed incapable of rational thought. This philosophical justification made Greek punishments particularly insidious. Violence was cloaked in intellectual legitimacy. Whipping a slave was not just permitted, it was portrayed as necessary for maintaining harmony in society. Greek history contains accounts of slave revolts, particularly among the helots of Sparta. These uprisings were met with overwhelming force. Rebels were executed en masse, their bodies displayed as warnings. Collective punishment was common. Entire communities of helots could be massacred for the actions of a few. Such repression reinforced the logic of fear. Slaves understood that rebellion was not merely dangerous but suicidal. The brutality of punishment ensured that even whispers of resistance carried the weight of terror. The starkest contradiction in Greek history lies in Athens, the birthplace of democracy. While citizens debated freedom, justice, and equality, their system rested on the brutalization of slaves who had none of these rights. The very concept of leisure necessary for philosophy and politics was purchased with the labor and suffering of enslaved people. This hypocrisy reveals the dual nature of Greek civilization, ideals of freedom for the few enforced by terror against the many. Slaves' punishments were not accidents or excesses, but integral to the functioning of Greek society. In Rome, punishment became spectacle. In Greece, it became ritualized fear. Both empires revealed how deeply cruelty was embedded in their visions of order, but Greece and Rome were not unique. To see the roots of these practices, we must look further back to Egypt and Mesopotamia, where punishment was sanctified by religion itself. Before Rome turned punishment into spectacle, and before Sparta institutionalized terror, the earliest civilizations laid the groundwork for cruelty. In Egypt and Mesopotamia, slavery was not just an economic necessity, but a sacred duty embedded into law and religion. These societies created some of the world's first codes of justice, yet their definitions of justice allowed and often demanded brutal punishments for the enslaved. By tying violence to divine will, they transformed cruelty into something sanctioned, even holy. Mesopotamia, the land between the Tigris and Euphrates, gave the world its first written laws. The Code of Hammurabi, c. 1754 BCE, outlined punishments for free citizens and slaves alike, but with a chilling double standard. For the enslaved, punishment was not designed to correct, but to crush. If a slave struck his master, the penalty was the cutting off of his ear, a punishment that permanently marked him as rebellious. Runaways were branded, mutilated, or executed. Families that sheltered fugitive slaves faced penalties as well, making escape nearly impossible. Women bore additional burdens. Female slaves accused of disobedience or immorality could be stripped, beaten publicly, or sold into harsher conditions. Their sexuality was tightly controlled, and accusations of impropriety often led to punishments meant not only to hurt, but to shame. Mesopotamian law did not merely permit such cruelty, it normalized it. Slaves were defined legally as property, and punishment was framed as a master's right. To discipline a slave was to maintain order not just in the household, but in the cosmos. In Mesopotamia, slavery and punishment were tied to the gods. Temples owned slaves, who labored to maintain the rituals that sustained divine favor. To disobey a priest or neglect temple duties was seen not only as rebellion, but as sacrilege. Punishment, therefore, was both earthly and spiritual. Runaway temple slaves could be branded with sacred symbols, ensuring that their bodies bore testimony to their crime against the gods. Punishments were sometimes carried out in temple courtyards, turning pain into ritual. In this way, cruelty was sacralized, presented not as human choice but as divine justice. Egyptian civilization is often remembered for its grandeur: pyramids, temples, colossal statues. Yet behind these wonders were enslaved laborers, many of them captives from foreign wars. Though debate remains about whether the pyramid builders were all slaves, records confirm that Egypt relied heavily on enslaved populations for construction, agriculture, and domestic service. Egyptian punishments for slaves reflected the state's obsession with order, or mahat. To disturb the social hierarchy was to defy cosmic balance. Rebellion was answered with beatings, whippings, and mutilations. Runaways were hunted, shackled, and paraded back to their masters. Branding and tattooing marked them as property, their bodies transformed into living documents of ownership. For women, punishments could include forced shaving of the head, a humiliating act in a culture where hair was a symbol of beauty and status. In both Egypt and Mesopotamia, whipping was the most common punishment for slaves. In Egypt, scenes on tomb walls even depict overseers beating laborers with sticks or whips, reinforcing the image of discipline as natural. These depictions were not meant to shock but to affirm hierarchy. Punishment was portrayed as part of maintaining order, just as farming or worship was. Slaves could also be sentenced to intensified labor. Those accused of disobedience might be forced into dangerous or backbreaking tasks, quarrying stone, hauling heavy blocks, or working in mines. These assignments were slow executions, wearing bodies down through exhaustion and exposure. Branding in Egypt was often symbolic as well as practical. Slaves could be marked with hieroglyphic symbols denoting their owner or status. This branding not only prevented escape but ensured lifelong humiliation. Mutilations were also used as deterrents. Cutting off ears or noses was a common practice in both Egypt and Mesopotamia. These punishments served two purposes: crippling the slave physically and branding them with visible marks of shame. In societies obsessed with physical appearance and honor, disfigurement was as powerful as death. As in other civilizations, enslaved women bore unique forms of punishment. Their bodies were sites of exploitation and control. In Mesopotamia, female slaves accused of disobedience might be forced into prostitution as punishment, their sexuality weaponized against them. In Egypt, women accused of rebellion or infidelity could be stripped, beaten, and publicly humiliated. Some records describe women paraded with heavy chains or collars, their degradation displayed as a lesson to others. These punishments reinforced patriarchal power by targeting not only the body, but the social roles of women as wives, mothers, and symbols of fertility. The brutality of Egypt and Mesopotamia was not hidden. Punishments were often public, staged in marketplaces, temple courtyards, or work camps. Just as in Rome centuries later, the spectacle of suffering served to warn others. A branded face or mutilated ear told the community that disobedience would not be tolerated. Public punishments also reminded free citizens of their own privileges. By witnessing the suffering of slaves, they were reassured of their own place in the hierarchy. Cruelty became a form of social theater, reinforcing the lines between master and servant, free and enslaved. The practices of Egypt and Mesopotamia did not vanish with their empires. Later, civilizations inherited their logic of punishment. That order required brutality, that the enslaved were property, and that humiliation was as effective as pain. Rome's crucifixions and Sparta's ritual killings can be traced back to these earlier traditions. By embedding punishment into religion and law, Egypt and Mesopotamia ensured that cruelty was not seen as arbitrary, but as natural. This legacy echoed across centuries, shaping the brutal systems of control that followed. In Mesopotamia and Egypt, punishment was sanctified by gods and rulers. In Greece, it was embedded in democracy and fear. In Rome, it became spectacle. Across all these empires, the enslaved lived under the shadow of pain. Yet the story does not end there. To understand the full scope of ancient cruelty, we must examine how rebellion was crushed and how collective punishment became one of history's most terrifying tools. Throughout ancient history, the enslaved did not remain silent. Despite overwhelming odds, they resisted, rebelled, and sought freedom. From the helots of Sparta to the slaves of Rome and Mesopotamia, uprisings erupted time and again. Yet the response from those in power was always the same: overwhelming brutality. Collective punishment became the ultimate tool of repression, ensuring that even whispers of rebellion carried catastrophic consequences. These punishments were not just about suppressing the guilty, they were about terrorizing the innocent, reminding all slaves that resistance was futile. Rebellion haunted every slave society. The larger the enslaved population, the greater the fear. In Rome, where millions were enslaved, uprisings threatened the very stability of the empire. In Sparta, helots outnumbered citizens several times over, making rebellion a constant concern. In Mesopotamia and Egypt, revolts periodically erupted, fueled by brutal conditions and unbearable demands. For masters and rulers, rebellion was not just an attack on property, it was an existential threat. If slaves succeeded, entire social systems could collapse. This fear explains why collective punishment was so widespread. It transformed rebellion into a crime that condemned entire communities, ensuring that the enslaved would police themselves out of sheer terror. The most famous slave rebellion in history erupted in Rome between 73 and 71 BCE, led by the gladiator Spartacus. Tens of thousands of slaves joined his revolt, defeating Roman armies and threatening the heart of Italy. For nearly 2 years, Rome trembled as the enslaved carved out their own freedom. When the rebellion was finally crushed, Rome's response was swift and savage. More than 6,000 captured rebels were crucified along the Appian Way, their bodies lining the road for miles. This was not just execution, it was theater. Rome wanted every slave, every citizen, and every traveler to see the price of defiance. But collective punishment extended beyond the battlefield. In 61 CE, when a Roman prefect named Pedanius Secundus was killed by a slave, the Senate decreed that all 400 of his household slaves should be executed, regardless of guilt. Despite public protests, the executions were carried out. The message was clear: rebellion by one meant death for all. In Sparta, the fear of helot rebellion was constant. Unlike in Rome, where revolts were occasional, helot uprisings were an ever-present possibility due to their overwhelming numbers. To maintain control, Sparta developed a system of institutionalized terror. The crypteia, a ritualized campaign of violence, allowed Spartan youths to murder helots at will. This annual purge served both as initiation for young warriors and as collective punishment for the helot population. No specific crime was necessary. Helots were killed simply to remind them of their subjugation. When rebellions did occur, reprisals were devastating. Entire villages of helots could be massacred, their families enslaved anew, their lands confiscated. Unlike Rome, where punishment followed revolt, Sparta ensured that punishment preceded it, making rebellion nearly unthinkable. Records from Mesopotamia and Egypt also describe slave revolts, though details are sparse. In both civilizations, the pattern was the same. Rebellion was answered with mass executions and public humiliation. Leaders of revolts were tortured and displayed, their bodies left as warnings. Families of rebels could be sold or mutilated, ensuring that the consequences of resistance spread far beyond the guilty. In Egypt, rebellious laborers in quarries or mines were often executed en masse, their bodies buried in shallow graves near the sites of their work. In Mesopotamia, insurrection against temple authorities was considered sacrilege, and rebels faced punishments not only from kings but from priests who framed suppression as divine will. For enslaved women, rebellion carried unique dangers. Even if they had no role in uprisings, women were often singled out for humiliating punishments designed to break communities. In Rome, Women connected to rebels might be raped before execution, their degradation staged as part of the spectacle. In Sparta, helot women were sometimes forced into degrading rituals, paraded publicly as symbols of defeat. In Egypt, enslaved women could be stripped of their children, sold separately as a form of punishment for perceived disobedience. These gendered punishments ensured that rebellion carried costs not just for men, but for entire families, deepening the terror of resistance. Collective punishments were almost always public. Executions took place in marketplaces, amphitheaters, or along major roads. The goal was not only to kill, but to display. Bodies left hanging, crucified, or mutilated served as permanent reminders of authority. This spectacle extended beyond slaves. Free citizens, too, were meant to watch and internalize the lessons. Public punishments reinforced the message that order required violence and that cruelty was a legitimate tool of governance. By making punishment communal, rulers ensured that fear became part of cultural memory. The psychological impact of collective punishment cannot be overstated. Knowing that one person's rebellion could doom an entire household or village created an atmosphere of paranoia. Slaves policed each other, discouraging dissent and reporting disobedience. The system weaponized fear, turning communities into instruments of their own oppression. Over time, this strategy embedded hopelessness into the enslaved psyche. Resistance seemed not only dangerous but futile. Even survival was tinged with guilt, as those who lived often did so because others had been sacrificed. The use of collective punishment in ancient empires left a long shadow. The principle that entire groups could be punished for the actions of a few resurfaced throughout history in medieval Europe, in colonial empires, and in modern systems of repression. Ancient rulers perfected a logic of terror that proved disturbingly effective and enduring. In Rome, Sparta, Egypt, and Mesopotamia, collective punishment was not an aberration but a core strategy. It ensured stability by making rebellion suicidal, embedding cruelty into the very foundations of empire. Across empires, slaves were punished not only for their actions, but for their existence. Their bodies became sites of violence, their communities targets of terror. Yet even in the face of overwhelming cruelty, stories of resistance survived. To understand the full picture, we must examine not only the punishments themselves, but the ways slaves endured, resisted, and left a legacy that outlasted their oppressors. The story of slavery-esque punishments in ancient empires is more than a chronicle of cruelty. It is a mirror reflecting how societies rationalize violence when it serves power. From Mesopotamia's codified mutilations to Egypt's sacred branding, from Greece's ritualized terror to Rome's theatrical executions, every empire devised ways to break the enslaved not just in body, but in spirit. These punishments were not anomalies. They were systems carefully constructed, legitimized by law, religion, and philosophy. At the core of these punishments lay a consistent logic. Power must be maintained through fear. Whipping, branding, mutilation, crucifixion, each was designed not only to discipline individuals but to terrify communities. Punishments worked as symbols, reminders that disobedience would not be tolerated. The lash was more than pain, it was propaganda. The cross was more than death, it was a message. This logic of cruelty was self-perpetuating. Rulers claimed that punishments were necessary because slaves were dangerous, but it was the very brutality of the system that made rebellion inevitable. Violence justified itself, creating a cycle that lasted centuries. The treatment of enslaved women reveals another layer of cruelty. Across empires, punishments targeted not only the body but femininity itself. Branding, stripping, sexual violence, and forced prostitution weaponized gender as a means of control. By humiliating women publicly, societies attacked the very roles of mother, wife, and nurturer. This targeting of women also sent a message to enslaved men. Resistance would not only cost their lives but destroy their families. The body of the enslaved woman became a canvas for messages of domination, intertwining patriarchy with slavery's violence. Public spectacle was essential. Whether in Roman amphitheaters, Spartan rituals, or Egyptian markets, punishment was meant to be seen. The suffering of the enslaved became entertainment, moral lesson, and warning all at once. These spectacles normalized cruelty, making it part of daily life. For free citizens, watching punishments reinforced their sense of superiority. Their freedom was defined not only by their rights, but by the absence of chains, lashes, and brands. Violence against slaves reassured them of their own place in the hierarchy. Yet despite overwhelming cruelty, the enslaved resisted. Spartacus's revolt shook Rome. Helots in Sparta fought for freedom. Runaways in Mesopotamia risked branding, mutilation, or death for a chance at escape. These acts of defiance, though often crushed, proved that slavery could never extinguish human will. Survival itself was resistance. To endure humiliation, to maintain traditions, to whisper forbidden songs or stories, these were acts of quiet rebellion. Even when bodies were broken, spirits endured, leaving legacies that history cannot erase. Perhaps the most shocking truth is the hypocrisy of these civilizations. Rome, the cradle of law, relied on crucifixions. Greece, the birthplace of democracy, sustained itself on whippings and terror. Egypt, guardian of cosmic order, branded women and mutilated men. Mesopotamia, inventor of written justice, normalized mutilation and dismemberment for the enslaved. These contradictions remind us that civilization has often been built on the backs of those denied humanity. The monuments we admire, the philosophies we study, the laws we inherit, all are stained with the suffering of the enslaved. Though ancient empires have fallen, the logic of cruelty survives. Collective punishment, gendered violence, and public humiliation still haunt modern systems. From prisons to forced labor, echoes of ancient brutality persist. Remembering these histories forces us to confront uncomfortable truths, that power still justifies violence, that exploitation still hides behind the mask of order, and that marginalized bodies remain targets of humiliation. But history also offers hope. The resilience of the enslaved, their rebellions, and their survival stories remind us that oppression is never absolute. Even in the darkest systems, sparks of resistance endure. When we walk among the ruins of Rome, admire the temples of Greece, or marvel at Egypt's pyramids, we must remember what lies beneath the stone. These wonders were not only monuments to human achievement, but also to human suffering. Behind every pillar and every inscription is a story of someone who was whipped, branded, or crucified to maintain the order we celebrate. To forget these punishments is to forget the people who endured them. To remember them is to honor their resilience and to recognize that cruelty, once normalized, can be repeated. The history of slavery's punishments is not just past, it is warning. So the next time someone romanticizes the glory of ancient empires, recall the crack of the whip in a Spartan field, the hiss of a branding iron in Mesopotamia, the crucifixions lining the Appian Way. Remember that civilization has always been a double-edged sword capable of brilliance, but too often built on brutality. And ask yourself, what marks will our society leave for the future?